Okay. Hello, everybody. So we are just waiting for people to come in. Everybody, just so you know, is on mute right now, and that's how we will have it for the program, that we will all be muted except for Dan and me currently.
All right.
Okay.
Make sure
Say
you're
hi.
muted.
I will in a minute, but she needs to be able to say hi.
I don't know who that's Howard, the
I'm
librarian.
going to mute it for you because they don't want to hear us.
So we are all still arriving, quote unquote.
Okay.
Howard, as people are coming in, I'm wondering, as we talk about these ideas of exile and home, whether folks want to put in the chat where they are. Be curious to know what city. And then we can get to know each other a little bit as our conversation proceeds in chat. Oh, wow. Oh, Chaya. Oh, from Israel. Thanks, Chaya. Nice to see you. All right. Paul Hamburg in Florida. Hi, Paul. All right, I think at 2:05, we're gonna start our program proper. And that will be Howard and then back to me.
Okay, so I will begin. So hi, everybody. I want to welcome all of you. And it's wonderful, especially seeing all the places that people are coming from. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. And I want to welcome all of you to today's virtual program with Dan Schifrin. This event was originally scheduled to take place in person at the library, so I'm especially happy that we're able to have the show go on, albeit virtually. And I want to invite you to go to jewishlearningworks.org, where you'll find a listing of our upcoming events happening on Zoom. The one I especially want to alert you to is happening next Sunday, also at 2 o'clock Pacific time, as a continuation of this series that we're calling Exile at Home, presented by the librarian StoryForward. This program will be entitled Exile at Home, The Humor Issue, and it will feature choreographer Marika Brussel and writers Caroline Kessler, Dan Schifrin, and Sarah Stone as they share thoughts and art on humor and creativity. All four of them are part of the Laba Fellowship at the JCC of the East Bay, and the JCC will be a co-presenter of the program along with Jewish Live. Some quick ground rules. Because we have a large number of attendees today, everybody is going to be muted during the program except for Dan. However, we do invite you to use the chat function, which for most of you is at the bottom of the screen, both to introduce yourselves as you've been doing, to make any comments to each other, and offer any questions that you would like Dan to answer at the end of the program. Dan Schifrin has taught creative writing at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, and served as writer in residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. He is an author and playwright whose stories and essays have been published widely. As part of a Laba Fellowship at the JCC of the East Bay, he is writing a play about medieval Jewish Spain and its influence on 21st century America. He's also the founder of StoryForward, a new approach to conversation and literature. I now turn it over to Dan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. This series, Exile at Home, came about because in the last several weeks, we've all kind of been exiled at home, exiled from much of our kind of creative and professional lives, even as we kind of sit at home and kind of try to make sense of what's happening in our world. It's interesting because on the one hand, we are all separate. On the other hand, we're all seeing each other in these intimate spaces in our homes and in our bedrooms or wherever we are. So right now I am actually kind of exiled to the basement of our house. I prefer to be upstairs in a comfortable chair next to some books, but this is where I have some peace and some Wi-Fi. But even so, even the idea of being exiled within my home is interesting because this place where I sit now is where I do my writing. And for me as a writer, as a Jewish writer, being home is actually where I write. And so right away, we have this kind of conflation or complexity, it's problematizing of what is home and what is exile. So our conversation today is going to be, in part, some reflections on my recent trip to Spain, in part, some reflections on what Spain and homeland might mean to the Jews, and also generally what homelands could mean to Jews and writers. So I'm going to talk maybe a half hour, and then I want to leave time for questions, and we'll see what happens. Okay. All right. Okay, what is a Jewish homeland, you might be asking? So that's a good question. So I think that all cultures tell us who they are by their stories. And Judaism and Jewish history and culture is no different. And I think the master story for Jewish life is actually about home versus exile. So, right, on the one hand, exile has been a fundamental part of Jewish existence. Our exiles from the land of Israel after the destruction of the first temple in 6th century BCE, and then in 70, created a situation where Jews were wandering, sometimes in better situations, sometimes in worse. But the whole idea of exile was generally pretty bad. It kind of hella sucked to be in exile. And so on the one hand, we are a people of exile, and that was considered something we wanted to rectify by going back to the land of Israel. On the other hand, Jewish culture began to tell different kinds of stories, and these stories suggest that exile, while bad, was not wholly bad, or rather there was something about exile that was creative, not ennobling, but it gave us something more and something different. And so I think that it would make sense for us to think about not thinking about home, not fetishizing home or exile, but looking at the two of them together, and the interplay between the two of them is, I think, what characterizes Jewish life, at least for the last 2,000 years. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen for a good part of our conversation, which means you have something else to look at other than myself. Okay, I'll go back. So I'm hoping everyone can see this. Howard, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Great, fantastic. Okay. Well, this is a picture of me and my daughter overlooking the city of Toledo in Spain. This is also the desktop of my computer. And these days I find myself looking out the window a lot just because I'm stuck at home. And here's just a window to another experience. All right. Right, so, okay, a little bit of etymology. The word diaspora is from the Greek. I love the Greeks, or at least their language. And diaspora means to scatter, but it also means to sow, S-O-W. And there's this interesting contradiction here because the Jewish people were scattered, but that scattering also sowed the seeds of their kind of creative revitalization. And I wanted to share a very short article that was recently published in Yedidot Achronot, the Hebrew newspaper, that just gives a sense of what home and exile could mean. Let's see if I can read it by moving this thing. Servants of trees and stones. I'm just going to read it real quick. Each monarchy in antiquity had its people, its land, its gods, its religion, and its temples. So it was for them all: Philistines, Babylonians, the Canaanite people, Chaldeans, Persians, Greeks, Romans. And when the monarchy was defeated, the temples destroyed, and the idol shattered, the people as well as the religion disappeared together with them. There's not even a single example of an ancient religion people that continued to survive after it experienced the total destruction of its religious and cultural center. Judaism alone withered the challenge. Only this dinosaur succeeded to survive. Not in the least was it because of the merit of the transmaterial religious mobility that it adapted. Through its cumulative experience, Judaism learned that cultural and spiritual assets are 7 times longer lasting than real estate. So, right, there's something about being out in exile that allowed us to create something that then allowed us to survive. This is one of the great paradoxes of Jewish life. Okay. Well, we'll get to that in one moment. So who am I? I'm Dan. I'm a writer. I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in extraordinary safety and privilege compared to most of what Jewish life and history had been. I felt tremendously rooted and do here in the Bay Area. But my family came from all over. My father came from Israel, before that from China. My mother's family came from Germany and Russia, and also from Israel. And even though I felt completely at home here, there was definitely a sense that I belonged, some part of me belonged elsewhere with all these stories and with all these peoples. And one of the patriarchs in our family was my grandfather, Joseph Papo. Here he is sitting at his desk. He was a Sephardic community organizer and scholar, and he wrote a book called In Search of Unity, which is a history of Sephardic Jews in America. And when I first started to think about what home meant, I remember I was sitting in his study and he was surrounded by these letters. He was constantly corresponding with people around the world. Part of the Sephardic diaspora, Sephardic meaning the kind of Jews who came or descended from Spain, from Iberia. And he wrote and received letters in Arabic and Hebrew and Ladino and Spanish and French and Italian, I think maybe even in Turkish. And there was something about this pile of letters on his desk, these interrelationships between Jews all over the world, these texts that felt to me home. There's something about the coziness of his den and also the window out to all these places that together felt like home to me. Okay, here is his book. No, his book is here. Available on Amazon. Okay. So I've started talking a little bit about Sephardic history in Spain. I think many of us on this call have some awareness of what we mean by that. I want to talk just a little bit more about Spain. And I'm going to show you some images. This is a map of Spain, Sepharad being Hebrew for Spain. So I'm going to share 2 paragraphs of history just to kind of bring us up to date before we go a little further into contemporary Spanish life. So Jews have lived in Spain since at least the 2nd century, with the possibility that Jews were there even before. Some biblical scholars associate the Tarshish of Jonah, the book of Jonah, this biblical whale journey, with southern Spain, possibly even near the port city of Malaga. So if you imagine Jonah is trying to escape from the land of Israel to go as far as he could in a boat, the farthest he could go would be around here, if you can see on the screen. Incidentally, Malaga is also where we became Spanish citizens, an interesting irony. So the golden age of Spanish Jewry took place mostly in the south, in Andalusia, these famous cities, Granada, Cordoba, Sevilla, and this is mostly the 9th to the 12th centuries. And this was when a network of Jewish and Christian and Muslim thinkers created this fairly harmonious society. And here their work in science and translation in some ways laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, and also provided us with an extraordinary number of Jewish cultural creations that still guide us to this day, right? And so that includes the work of Maimonides, the 12th century physician and philosopher, and the poetry and other philosophical works of Yehuda Halevi, as well as the writing of the Zohar. And the Zohar took place a little bit further up here, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so 9th to 12th century, things were going pretty well. Things started to get worse with fanatic Almohads coming from North Africa and the Crusaders coming from here. Things got worse and worse for Jews for centuries. They mostly started moving up and up. And by 1391, rather than 1492, in some ways Jewish life effectively shifted. And over the next century, it was harder and harder to be Jewish. The Inquisition had begun. In 1492, rather than being the moment when things went bad, that was kind of the ending. That's when the Edict of Alhambra was issued and the expulsion took place. Okay. I'm gonna do a quick check on the chat. I think someone was signaling to me. Okay. Everything's good. Okay. Okay. Up to 250,000 Jews lived in Spain at that time. And there are a huge number of Jews, or Spaniards today, who believe that they have Jewish background. And then when I was in Spain, I was curious to read more about both the 16th century painter Velázquez, as well as Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, and there's strong evidence that both of them were secret Jews, were crypto Jews. So I always like to claim those as our own. Okay, give me 1 second, please. I'm just gonna check one more thing for the chat. Okay. Howard, on my screen, I'm having trouble going back to the chat. Will you just, will you pipe up in a few minutes and let me know what's happening on the chat side? Okay, fantastic. We will keep going. Okay. Just a tiny bit more about kind of one person's history. So our family goes back to Spain. We can't figure out how far back, we can't figure out exactly the route back, but we can trace it back to Rabbi Eliezer Papo, who was born in 1785 in Sarajevo. He moved to Bulgaria, where he was a rabbi. He wrote this book, The Essential Paleoets. You can see a version of it here. And probably we're able to track our family starting there because he had written a book and was a prominent rabbi, and all of a sudden people started paying attention. After that, his descendants moved to Jerusalem. My great-grandfather, Michael or Michel Papo, was a founder of Betula in the north of Israel. They went to Egypt before World War I to study cotton growing with the intent to go back to the Galil in the north of Israel. World War I got in the way. They ended up going to Cleveland, to the States. And that's how my mom's side of the family came here. That brings us up almost to 1992, the 500th anniversary of the expulsion. And for those of us who were around in 1992, we probably remember there being a lot of attention paid to Sephardic Jewish life. That was, I think, a moment in the American Jewish consciousness when there was a realization that we weren't only Russian, or Polish Jews, that there were all these Jews that had been here for centuries, including the first Jews in the Americas. And that kind of a Sephardic Jewish identity became, our awareness of the importance of Sephardic Jewish identity became more prominent. 1992 was also the year of the Barcelona Olympics, and that's when King Juan Carlos donned a yarmulke and sat with President of Israel, Chaim Herzog, and formally apologized for everything that had happened, which was quite a moment. Just as a small example of ways in which kind of the Sephardic Jewish experience has percolated into what's the word I want to use? What previously had been more of a traditional Ashkenazi American Jewish style is that our Yom Kippur services at our synagogue, Netivot Shalom in Berkeley, has Ashkenazi services, and we also have Sephardic Yom Kippur services. So that's something that I've appreciated. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Right, so, Spain over the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, started to feel kind of bad about getting rid of all their Jews. 1992 was a watershed moment, but before that, the Spanish government had made some attempt to bring in Jews, especially in North Africa, who had been expelled from their countries after the establishment of Israel. And in 2015, there was a sense that more could be done or should be done. And an announcement was made that Jews who could demonstrate that they had come from Spain would be allowed back into Spain as citizens. Interestingly, you didn't have to be Jewish or demonstrate any Jewishness to do this. You just had to demonstrate that you had Sephardic background, which was difficult to do, but not impossible. And there are all these different ways. We can maybe talk about that at the end of the conversation if that's interesting to people. So we spent 2 years doing all the paperwork for this. I had to take a day-long Spanish language test, oral and written, as well as take the Spanish citizenship test in Spanish. And then we went to Spain last summer and did the final paperwork, and we're waiting for our passports. This law sunsetted a few months ago. It was extant for about 3 years. And it seems like about 40,000 Jews will be successful in getting Spanish citizenship, which more or less doubles the number of Jews who live in Spain now, which is about 50,000, most of whom are from or descendants of Jews from North Africa, as well as a lot of Israelis and then other students and expats from various countries. Okay. Let's look at a few more images. Okay. I'm really curious to see how many folks have been to Spain. I don't know if you could just, Howard, great. Folks could put that in the chat. I'd be really curious. And if so, which cities you've been to. I'd like to take a look at that a little bit later. That'd be very interesting to know. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit. Andalusia, 9th to 12th centuries is where so much of the Spanish Jewish Renaissance happened, down here. And one of the centers was Cordoba, an extraordinary city. In Cordoba lived Maimonides. This is an 18th century likeness of him with the hat and the medallion and everything. This is a more recent look. This is a sculpture of him in Maimonides Square in Cordoba. This is my son, Aviv, and my daughter, Elia. Aviv was super excited about Maimonides because he was a scientist and philosopher. So there he is. Cordoba also has, among other beautiful pieces of architecture, this Roman bridge. You can see people crossing it here. It's 2,000 years old, and it's where I somehow imagine Jews first coming to Iberia. And there's two of my kids. My other son is hiding somewhere. And this is literally where I imagined them disembarking from Israel after being exiled. Probably it wasn't, but we are a people of memory more than history in many ways. So that's what it is. Okay. I want to show you also the Great Mosque in Cordoba. This is kind of an extraordinary building. Many of these buildings, it's hard to see the delicacy and the nuances of the architecture and the space and the light in these two-dimensional pictures. But if you've been there, you understand the way in which you are just enveloped in the architecture. And this is a kind of like a Spanish/Arabic, Christian Arabic mix. It's Muhadar architecture, which is pretty common for this period and this time. Okay. In Cordoba, we first started to notice these markings on the ground. And if we were all together, I would ask what you would see. But I will tell you, so you see right to left in Hebrew, Sfarad, meaning Spain. But inside of that, you see something else. In the gray, you see the Hebrew word Zachor. And I just love this idea of the kind of memory being inside of Spain. And for me, it's a great design element, and the gold with the golden age of Jewish life, at least until now. But it also, I think, says something about stories and memory, how at the end of the day, as I said before, that we are the people of memory. And this is kind of a fantastic graphic representation of it. Okay. Seville. It's the great cathedral in Seville. It was also the home of the Bourbonnais, who were the financiers to the King of Castile. This was a moment when Seville, which at one point was the largest city in Europe, was the capital of the Spanish Empire. Another extraordinary city. And then we have the third major city in the south, Granada. Granada is the place where Columbus left for the New World. This is Granada at night. The Alhambra is, again, this extraordinary fortress and castle, the best preserved of medieval castles in the world, I think. A detail inside the Alhambra. Again, it's very hard to see. If you see at the top, you can see the detail of this kind of plaster lattice work. What you can't see is these, in the middle, you can get a sense of these, they're actually 3D, they're these like stalactites that come down from the ceiling, and you're inside this, you're in like some kind of, I don't know, otherworldly, almost like an alien experience, like you're in a planetarium or something. Really something. I hope everyone has a chance to go. Then I want to bring you up for a moment to Toledo. Toledo was again, the imperial city as Spain kept moving up near Madrid, city of Don Quixote. And briefly, I just want to show you kind of the main synagogue in Toledo. There are two of them, El Tránsito and La Blanca. La Blanca is a very strange place that it's really more like a church. That could be a whole nother conversation. And inside, again, you see these kind of this soaring top. The architectural term is escaping me now. And then you can see, and I'll show you a detail in a second, you can see here the Hebrew letters and words, and these are the Psalms. The whole building is ensconced by Psalms, and we'll go a little closer here, and you can see it. You can see it here, and we're going to come back and talk about kind of language and architecture in just a couple minutes. Okay, just a couple more places to show. Right, so in this kind of northern plains of Spain, Leon, Valladolid, Zaragoza, and also Avila, which isn't on the map, but which is around here. This is where the 13th century Kabbalists that created the Zohar lived. Moses de Leon, who was the author or the co-author or the channeler of the Zohar from Leon, Moses de Leon. And his group of Kabbalists kind of like wandered here, also in Guadalajara. And here they created the Zohar, which is the kind of like the classic work of Jewish Kabbalah and spirituality. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too when we get to a little bit more of text study. Okay. And then finally, we'll go up to the north here, Barcelona, capital of Catalan. And next to it, which you don't see, is the city of Girona. And Girona is where Nachmanides lived, another famous Jewish Kabbalist and scientist. And in Barcelona, there is evidence of ancient Jewish life as well, probably going back to the 2nd century. Here I'm showing you a stone in the old wall of the city in the Jewish quarter called El Kai. It's spelled C-A-L-L, but it's pronounced El Kai. And this stone is actually a gravestone from up the hill, at the top of the hill in Barcelona. The hill is called Mont Juif, which means like the Jew mountain. It actually is kind of like the earliest settling place of Barcelona. And as often happened, when people needed stones, they took stones from graveyards, and who was going to protest the least or had the least power? The Jews. So they took these stones and they threw them up to make a wall. So there's something extraordinarily careless and cruel about this. And there's also something really interesting and I don't know, compelling about having somebody's name as you walk into the neighborhood on the stone. There's something permanent about it and its placement where I walk in, I kind of give kavod, I give honor to those Jews who died. And the stone exists. Up in the graveyard, it wouldn't anymore. Okay. So, our journey in Spain, as maybe I should have said this as I detailed in a long essay in the J, the Jewish News Weekly of Northern California. You can see that article online. I talk in more detail about some of these things. And this is the last picture of our trip. This is when we are in Malaga in the south. This is where we signed the papers to be Spanish citizens. This is the rest of my family. Some of you may know them. And then we went out for a drink. All right. Howard, anything interesting on the chats you want to bring into our conversation? Not exactly, not yet. Okay. Let's get some excellent questions going if we can. I want to hear from folks as much as I can as we get toward the end. Okay. Yehuda Halevi. Okay. So I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about a couple works of Jewish literature from this period. Right, so one is the poetry of Yehuda Halevi, maybe the greatest medieval Hebrew poet. It's one of his poets. You can take a look at it while I'm talking. This one is called My Heart is in the East. It's a famous poem, and it's one that we often read in various ritual environments. He was someone who grew up in the South, moved to the North. He was kind of an elite member of the kind of mixed Jewish Muslim cultural elite. He soured on Spain, in part probably because of the increasing violence. There were some other religious and philosophical developments that he went through. We don't know that much about his personal life to know about that. But this is a poem that suggests something deep about the anger and anxiety of exile. So I'm going to read it real quick. My heart is in the East. My heart is in the East, and I in the uttermost West. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds, while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? A light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things behind in Spain, seeing how precious in mine eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. So this is really kind of a classic cry de coeur of Jews in exile and how they hope more than anything to go back to Israel. And this is an example of kind of the Zionist urge that goes back thousands of years to leave behind exile and to go home. Okay. But also in Spain, we have this other, let's see, no, sorry. Right. We have a kind of like a counter story in a way. This story is about the group of Kabbalists who wrote the Zohar. So what is a Zohar? It's a very, very long and complicated book that maybe I'll say on one foot is a series of stories and a series of midrashim, of drashim, of exegeses on the Bible. And these are kind of really wild and crazy stories and explanations, full of erotic imagery, full of donkeys and children who speak the word of God. It's really an extraordinary book. It appears to be written by Moses de Leon, who was the leader of this group of Kabbalists. It is attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous 2nd century Jewish mystic. And for centuries, traditional Jews believed it was from that time, and it somehow found its way to Spain. But all kind of real linguistic, philological evidence suggests that it was written about that time. And this book is about Shimon Bar Yochai and his students who wander around the land of Israel. They wander all night long talking, and by daylight, when the sun comes up, they have some kind of revelation. But in fact, the book is really a record of Moses de Leon and his group, in this case of men, of Kabbalists who walked around they had their same experience. It's kind of what they call pseudepigrapha, which is writing something now and attributing it to an earlier time. But there's something extraordinary about the creativity that goes on in this moment of exile. And to kind of bring that home, I want to just share something from the author Melila Hellner-Eshed. She's a scholar in Jerusalem. Her recent book is called "The River Flows from Eden: The Language of Mystical Experience in the Zohar." And she kind of unpacks a series of reflections in the Zohar about the generation that lived in the desert, that went into Exodus. And she talks about how, right, in Jewish tradition, we think about these Jews who left Egypt as being slave-like in some way, and that no one who had left Egypt would somehow be free enough or have the spiritual depth or insight to go into the land of Israel. So it's only when everyone died who had left Israel, 40 years or so, that those who were born in the desert could go into the land of Israel. Another way of saying it is that those people were somehow harmed or traumatized or kind of unable to fulfill the ability to go to Israel. And she points out that in the Zohar, that generation in the desert that was kind of in this first great exile in a way, was actually the highest, they exhibited the highest level of spirituality, to the extent that they didn't need land, they didn't need a homeland per se, they had the connection to God out in the desert. And because of that, and because of their relationships with each other, they existed at the highest possible level. And this says something, this is maybe my interpretation, it is my interpretation, that there's something about these group of Jews in Spain wandering around, obviously not a perfect life, but they felt that there was something that being in exile gave them, that it made them closer to God in some way, and they were grateful for that gift. They were grateful of a certain gift of exile. They imagined in some ways God was also in exile, and they were all in exile together. So you see within a couple generations of each other in Spain, you have Moses de Leon and Yehuda Halevi, who come to opposite conclusions in some ways about the value of exile. More on that another time. Okay. Okay. Oh, I want to, right, we talked about, right, Sfarad and Zahor, we talked about memory being embodied within kind of the gold of Sfarad. And I want to talk just a little bit more about these Psalms and a metaphor of the architecture of the interior of this synagogue El Transito in Toledo, right? And so, and this is part of kind of a larger sense that I have about how writing, space, and time are all interconnected in Jewish life in the kind of interesting and strange ways. So put another way, I have the strong sense that for Jews, the homeland of the Jews is the text. I'm far from the first to say this, but I've come into this awareness, you know, in my own idiosyncratic way, as all of us do. So when I was standing inside of the synagogue, I felt that I was literally inside of a text with the Psalms kind of circular, wasn't circular, but kind of surrounding me in this way. And I thought about how in poetry, the word stanza, which is this kind of, you know, a group of lines, in Italian actually means room. So there's something in our, you know, in our DNA as humans that connects storytelling and home in some way. And I think Jews, is it Groucho Marx who said Jews are like everyone else, only more so? I think for Jews that we have the sense of story and home and text like other peoples do, but, you know, turbocharged. Okay. And I guess maybe I'll say like a, you know, a cognate of this, that when if we're in synagogue and we open up the Torah, we have the sense that God is somehow in the Torah, in the text. It's the reason we have such reverence for it. There's kind of like a cognate, I think, a metaphor, a connection between what it means for God to live within the Torah and the text, where the text is God's home, and then for us to feel that we are also somehow at home within the text, with the symbol of someone standing in a synagogue surrounded by the Psalms. You know, I have kind of like a sci-fi approach to this also. Some of my friends who like Star Trek will hopefully appreciate this to another level. I feel that there is a way in which Jews live in this weird kind of like, I don't know, outside of space and outside of time in some way. Now, I don't want to be too kind of romantic about this, but I feel like even a cursory look at Jewish literature and the way in which Jewish literature is structured, even visually, suggests that something really interesting and strange is going on. So going forward to backwards in time, I just want to pull up one of my favorite series of texts. This is from philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel from the book The Sabbath. This is probably a book that a lot of people know. So I have the text here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a very simple idea, right? It's the idea that the Jewish Sabbath, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews, and that the Jewish home and God's home is somehow the Sabbath, and that in some way the Sabbath as a cathedral in time is the true home of the Jews. That always blows me away when I think about that. And I think about kind of the sci-fi term I think of myself as the wormhole, right? The place where if you're out in space, it's some kind of like strange black hole experience where you go into it and you come out the other side and you're in another quadrant of the universe, which because of the distance means you're also in another time period. And so a whole nother conversation I would love to have about Jews and science fiction. But there is something about Jews talking to each other and being at home across time and space in ways that maybe other cultures haven't found as interesting or helpful. And so, and then the last slide, I want to just show a picture of the Talmud, right? So this is, I meant to attribute the person who wrote these descriptions, and I maybe can do that afterwards. I think many of us are probably familiar with the Talmud page. It has at least these 4 parts, and you can see in the middle, it's my mouse. Can people see this? Howard, can you see this mouse moving? Okay. So here we have the Mishnah, which is the oldest part of the Talmud, the oral Torah. And you can read a little bit more about what this is, but it's basically like the proof text, like the earliest levels of teaching. Gemara above and below. And these are the commentaries on the Mishnah, either from Babylon or from Jerusalem. They're 2 separate canons. Most people read the Babylonian ones. And then here on the right, you have kind of we have the Mishnah. I'm sorry, in between progressives. Rashi up at the far right, who is a French Provençal commentator of the Talmud, considered the most important single commentator on the Talmud. And over here, the Tosafot, a little bit later, more in France and Germany, who had their own series of conversations and conflicts with Rashi. So, right, there's something about people talking across time and generations in Jewish life that suggests to me that home for Jews is not about one thing for sure. It's not even about one place for sure. It is about relationships and being in conversation. So, it's funny, like I look at the 2 parts of my screen here, I see the Talmud on one side, and on the right side, I see all these faces. I see all of us, participating from all over the country, all over the world. And so that should seem really strange, but it's come to seem like a normal thing for us in the last few weeks, in the same way that having a page of Talmud like this, where people are talking across generations, space and time make no difference. It's kind of this crazy idea. So something about home for Jews, I think, being in this network of relationships that's mediated through text. Okay. All right. Here I come to my conclusion. I think this is the last slide. There's the last slide. Okay, I'll leave this up for 1 more minute. So I just been thinking a lot about Passover. What a strange moment in time, and what a strange Passover I think almost all of us are going to have this year. I don't know if Elijah has a mask or like how he's getting around. Well, that's again another conversation. But I just want to reflect on kind of a famous thing from Malachi, the book of Malachi, about the Messianic times, right? And so he says that the Messianic times will come when Elijah turns the hearts of the children to the parents and the hearts of the parents to the children. And this is a moment when everyone somehow is able to return home, not through apocalypse or Armageddon, but through some kind of peace. So I think about that, and I think about what home means in that context. And so for me, I think about home. Elijah comes to our homes. My teacher, Rabbi Chaim Seilerfeller, talks about the Seder being the staging ground for a messianic possibility, where Elijah comes and Elijah sees that people are talking to one another, that the children are talking to the parents and the parents are talking to the children. Why he doesn't stay in those moments and usher in the Messianic era, I don't know. But there's something profound for me and what I want to think and experience more this year when I think about the questions that the children ask the parents, which is essentially the 4 questions, which is about, how do things work? What is the nature of our life? What are the nature of these rituals? What is the matzah? Why do we recline? What are all these stories? And then I thought that the adults, they answer them, they turn their attention to them, but the adults also ask a question. And the question the adults ask, which might seem not that important, is where the hell is Afikomen, right? So, and the children have to answer in order for the conversation to continue. And when I looked up the Greek root of Afikomen, it's always the Greek etymologies. It means either dessert or revelry, to revel. And I misread that as a reveal. So for me, there was something about the Afikomen and the children and the adults in conversation that revealed something about the real possibility of home. In other words, home is a state of mind in which the generations listen to each other. And exile is when we're all too busy arguing to even hear Elijah's arrival. So those are my thoughts for you on this rainy Sunday afternoon. I would love to have some conversation and questions. Howard, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, and I'm going to try to get back to chat by unsharing my screen.
Sure, Dan, so we've gotten a few questions both to everybody and to me privately. So I can start with one, which is a question of what exactly does citizenship mean to you? Why was it important for you to become a citizen of Spain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought a lot about that, and I think that my answers changed over time since I started, and then my time there, and then afterwards. And so, yeah, there are several reasons why we did it. I'm not sure myself which of them was the most important, but right in this order, the election of 2016 had happened, and I felt this atavistic anxiety about what happens to Jews and how many generations Jews can live in one place before the shit hits the fan. It was just this primal response to wanting to have another place. Now, of course, there's also Israel, and I would imagine that I would go to Israel before I would go to Spain. But even that, there was something about, well, maybe I need 3 places. Like, how many places does a Jew need to have to feel safe? So there was just like a response, defensive response to that. 2, I was curious. I was really curious about what this experience was going to be. It ended up being much more time and more expensive than I had expected. And if I knew that, maybe I wouldn't have done it. I don't know. But just like, as a writer, I wanted to go through this process and observe what it was like. Who was going to go? What would this moment like? I wanted to have a record of it for myself. So I did it as a kind of an experience. In the middle of this, we realized that my older son could maybe go to college in Europe for free as an EU citizen. And so we went through that process. And he actually applied to colleges in Amsterdam, which would be extremely cheap for us to do. and that's another conversation. So, right, so citizenship versus living somewhere is an interesting question. The thing that was hardest for me is that at some point when the passports come, I have to go to the consulate in San Francisco and I have to express loyalty or fealty to the King of Spain. That feels really weird to me. And so I don't know how I'm going to manage that or how I'm going to explain that to myself or to my kids.
Great. So I'm going to now ask you, there were two questions that I'm going to ask you as one. They both came from Sarah's. The first is, can you talk about the ways you use tradition and the contemporary, the texts and other elements? What kind of processes do you have for bringing them together in your own work? And the other question related is if you could talk about the play that you're working on that's Spain related.
Yeah, thanks. I think the two things are related. What should I say? Yes, I forgot. Another reason I went to Spain was that because I had started thinking about Spain in other contexts, and I wanted to do a little bit of research. I forgot about that one. So, okay, so I'm writing this play, and this play is about the wife of Moses de Leon, this writer or channeler of the Zohar. We don't know anything about her at all. And she called to me over time and space in the way that I've been talking about. I don't know why, but she called to me and she wanted her story told. And I felt compelled to listen. And somehow on this end of the telescope, that there was a contemporary playwright. Her name is Zoe. I'm making her up. And she heard the call also. And so what's happening is that the two of them are now in some kind of conversation, and I'm learning along with the characters what is happening, but the two of them have something to teach each other. I think that Zohara, as I'm calling this wife of Moses de Leon, is looking for freedom, to be unstuck from the shackles of being a woman in that moment in time, and is looking to the future for freedom, whereas Zoe, this kind of secular playwright, has no structure, only has freedom, and she's looking for structure and meaning, and the two of them are somehow meeting in the middle. So that's kind of what the play is about, and kind of that answers maybe the first question in a way, which is that I feel like tradition and the contemporary world constantly come together, and that it's one conversation for me, and I feel like this play is in some ways an example or a manifestation of that process.
Great, thank you. And so, and people can still ask a question in the chat, and I will ask it of Dan. So a question was, how was Jewish literature and spirituality impacted by living in close quarters with Muslims?
In Spain, I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of this. I mean, I've spent some time thinking and reading about it. I mean, I think that what we do know is that the medieval Jewish poets wrote in Hebrew, but they also wrote in Arabic, and the forms that they wrote in were deeply influenced by Arabic forms. There's one called the Ghazal that my friend Dan Alter, the poet, has introduced to me, which I think is Persian, definitely Middle Eastern. And so there's a huge influence on Jewish thinkers, philosophers and poets from Arabic, both from Arabic language and Arabic modes of poetry, as well as philosophy. So part of what happened was that the works of antiquity, philosophical, scientific, dramatic, were kind of lost to most of Europe. But I think in Baghdad and maybe in Cordoba also, there were these academies of translation that took them from Greek into Arabic, and from Arabic they passed into the European languages. And Jews were a part of that early because they were in southern Spain. So Maimonides and these other philosophers were deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. And so the philosophical and the literary and the ritual developments that happened were intimately connected with what was happening culturally in the Arabic world. You can't disentangle them.
Okay, so those are the questions, to my knowledge, that we have.
Okay.
So I
finally found chat again after all this time. Okay.
So I do want to thank you for a wonderful presentation, And I want to thank everybody for joining us and wish everybody a wonderful Passover, albeit a strange Passover. And everybody, please keep safe.
All right.
And again, please join us next Sunday at 2 o'clock for another conversation that will be facilitated by Dan. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Why?
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How do you do this bit?
This is like the after party.
It's really good.
Yeah. I'm gonna turn off our streaming service to Facebook and YouTube.